Hello, everyone, and welcome to the People's Forum. Is this anyone's first time here? Oh, okay. Well, a big hearty welcome from us at the People's Forum. We are a political education center, community center, all centered around lifting up working class struggles here at home and internationally. This means we wear a lot of different hats. Of course, we do book talks, conferences, organizations come here and have their events. Sometimes they have their regular meetings here, but we also do our own programming. We have movies every Thursday from all over the world. We also have concerts, sometimes a fashion show, sometimes art workshops, dance workshops. So no matter how you invest yourself in liberation movements, you have a home here. Sweet. One of the things I'd like to highlight is today is actually our last day of applications being open for our biggest class of the year that we do every single year, our Revolutionary Summer School. This year, it's centered on Pan-Africanism and how essential it is to understanding the struggles on the continent of Africa and connecting it to our struggles here at home. It's a 6-week course. It's hybrid, so even if you aren't based in New York City, you can always tune in virtually. Sometimes, if you don't have the capacity to join us for every class or do group work, we have a self-paced course so you can study, get the recordings, all the materials on your own. And so as a political education center, based around working class struggles, we also understand deeply the cruelty of US imperialism. We see how it works to disenfranchise the working class every single day, and internationally, how it wreaks havoc across the world, around the world, and causes the very circumstances that causes people to flee their homes and leave their families, only to face the violence of the immigration system. And so that's why we're very excited to be hosting tonight's talk on Rivermouth, A Chronicle of Language, Faith, and Migration by Alejandra Oliva. It is a memoir that traces It is a memoir that traces a rich history of family, of history, of injustice, and of joy. I won't go too much into it because I'm sure you guys will talk about it way more and probably way better than I'll try to briefly summarize here. So I'll just take this time to introduce our two speakers today. Of course, we have the author herself, Alejandra Oliva, who is an essayist, translator, immigrant justice advocate, and embroiderer. She is a recipient of the 2022 Creative Nonfiction Writing Grant, and her writing has been included in Best American Travel Writing 2020 and was nominated for a Pushcart Prize. She was honored with an Aspen Summer Words Emerging Writers Fellowship, and she was the Frank Fellow at the Yale Whitney Humanities Center in 2022. Joining her in conversation is Carina del Valle Schorske, who is a writer and translator of Puerto Rican literature. Her essays and criticism have been published in many venues, including The Believer, Book Forum, and the New York Times Magazine, where she is a contributing writer. In 2022, she won a National Magazine Award for her cover story on social dancing in times of crisis, and she holds a PhD in comparative literature from Columbia University. Her debut essay collection, The Other Island, was honored with a Writing Nonfiction Grant in 2020 and is forthcoming from Riverhead Books. So thank you to all of you for joining tonight, and of course, thank you to Astor House for producing this wonderful book and collaborating with us on this event. And a final note is that TPF the People's Forum is celebrating its 5th anniversary, which is a huge deal for us. If you love tonight's event, if you're interested in anything we've got going on, I encourage you to go to 5years.peoplesforum.org, donate. We're continuing to fundraise and consider how important the work that we do here is. But other than that, I'll pass it over to you two. Thank you so much.
This seems more on.
Yes.
Yeah. 2 on, perhaps. But I love to get 2 on. So tonight, I'm so happy to be here, and Alejandra's book is beautiful. We actually met in 2 different ways. You probably heard from the bios that we both won the Writing Creative Nonfiction Grant, but we really met through Alejandra's editor, Danny Vasquez, who kept texting me, and he usually doesn't text me about his book, saying, no, it's this one. This is the one that I really think you're gonna love. And so there's a thread between us of translation and of a certain kind of writing that kind of defies genre or weaves between modes. So I'm really happy to be able to share the stage with Alejandra tonight. And I think she's gonna start us off by reading us a passage from her book, and then we'll dive deeper into conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Carina. The feeling is absolutely mutual. Your piece in the Times, what's it called? In a letter of recommendation for translation is one of my favorite pieces that I come back to over and over again. So I'm really excited to be here with you. Thank you so much to the People's Forum for hosting us and for everyone setting up this awesome event, for selling books, for running audio and the live stream. Hello, everyone. And yeah, I would love to get started with a reading from the beginning of the book. I am sitting in a church basement just off Washington Square Park, across the table from a woman who's only been in the United States for 3 weeks. Between us sits an I-589 form, the application for asylum and for withholding of removal. And we're surrounded by a handful of other people, pens poised, hands hovering over their keyboards, ready to take notes on our conversation. Lista? I ask. She nods. We're ready, I tell the group, and we dive in. It's the last day of January 2017. 11 days earlier, Donald Trump was sworn into office, and in the next 4 years, the United States immigration system, especially the asylum system, will be systematically dismantled, rule and regulation by rule and regulation. One attorney general after another will step in to review and reverse the Board of Immigration Appeals rulings, restricting asylum categories one by one. Entire nationalities and religions will be banned from entering the United States. The Federal Register will become cluttered with proposed rules limiting asylum, raising fees for application processing, cutting off immigration. The various tentacle branches of the Department of Homeland Security, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, Customs and Border Protection, the Border Patrol, will grow and extend into quasi-paramilitaries at the president's beck and call, deployed into two welcoming sanctuary cities. The premise of birthright citizenship will be questioned, parents will be separated from their children, tent cities to house migrants will be erected in the desert, and then eventually pushed back across the border into Mexico. Miles upon miles of a big, beautiful border wall will actually be built up across parklands and grounds sacred to the indigenous. But at this table, at the beginning of 2017, none of that has happened yet. Today, I'm sitting across from a woman, Myra, let's call her, and we're filling out an application so that she can stay in the United States. The question of where Myra will be allowed to call home is so critical because the answer is a matter of life or death. Back in Honduras, where she had lived her whole life up until a few weeks ago, her brother was shot in front of her, and the guy who did it told her that she would be next. This asylum application is her best shot at convincing the US government that her survival is dependent on staying in the country. Even though we are all here around this table ready to fill out this application together, all of us wish we did not have to be. I and the team of volunteers around me wish Myra's presence in this country was not, to some extent, contingent on the strength of my translation for this application, on the tear-jerkiness or trauma of Myra's story. The US government appears to wish Myra was not here at all. Myra wishes that this translation we are working on was unnecessary. She would rather her life had continued in its familiar way, her brother alive, her family together in Honduras. And yet, here we all are, Myra, a table full of volunteers, and the US government, collaborators on this translation that nobody really wants. While the task at hand may be simple, linear even, figuring out how to best explain to the United States government that Myra is afraid to return to Honduras because her life is at risk there, trauma often complicates the telling of a story like Myra's. If you've experienced deep grief, if you've lived through any kind of event with an aftermath, you know the way that time fractures and splinters, the way true things take on the sheen of unreality while dreams feel vivid and visceral. You also know how talking about any of it can sometimes feel like reliving it, your pulse thundering in your ears, time shattering all over again, your breath stuttering out of you. My job, sitting across the table from Myra, is to let her talk, to ask clarifying questions and see if, through the interview, new information can be shaken loose, placed in a chronological order to form a cohesive narrative with cause and effect. My job is also to take her words and carry them across from the Spanish she has spoken her entire life into English, the language spoken by most people in the United States, and the language spoken by the government officials at the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services that will read and judge her application. Myra is just one of thousands of Spanish-speaking immigrants who have come to the United States from the entire spread of nations to the south, often fleeing the results of American imperialism. Gang members deported from over-policed, under-resourced communities in Los Angeles full of refugees fleeing the dirty wars in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador that were in turn caused by CIA destabilization of the region, Chilean and Argentine refugees fleeing US-installed dictators, Mexican farm and factory laborers have left hungry after the US's extortionary trade agreements. There are Tejano families in South Texas that never moved, just had the border pass over them until their language was the wrong one. Spanish speakers of the United States have little in common as a group. They are of different races, religions, nationalities, political alignments, economic classes, immigration statuses. The things they do have in common are a shared language and the shared misfortune of proximity to a world superpower. And all many of their US-born children have in common is often not even a language, just a vague and uneasy sense of cultural alliance to something incomplete, full of holes and misunderstandings that at best feels empty and superficial, and at its worst feels harmful and hegemonic. I wrote this book because our shared language reminded me that the stories we tell are a foundation for change. Translation comes from the Latin translatus, to carry across. The word itself implies an edge, a dividing line. To translate means to carry across languages, across borders, across cultures. Translation is something we do with our bodies, something that lives in our blood. We move through our mother tongue into new homes. We sense what the right word or phrase is, not with our minds necessarily, but with some kind of bodily intuition where shades of meaning dwell. Our bodies remember the specific flavor of words in two languages, the flavor of the edge between two ways of saying. As the word implies, we also use our bodies to carry meaning from one language to another. I've done all kinds of translation, the kind that involves sitting across from someone knee to knee and feeding their words back to them in a different language, translation of books, of essays and articles for teenagers, of know your rights pamphlets and legal documents, of someone's words well after they've spoken them. It's impossible not to feel what I am translating inside my body, impossible not to carry it with me from a church basement or a plaza, or after I hang up the phone, damp and hot from being pressed next to my ear for an hour. In my translations for asylum seekers, this goes double. Their stories are often ones of violence against their bodies, stories that pass through me as they pass through the language. I can catalog on my own body the places where people have shown me their scars as I've translated their stories, turning me into a mirror. Cigarette burns on the back of a carefully manicured hand, the aftermath of a surgery that was itself the aftermath of a stabbing, someone's chest and the softness of their belly crisscrossed with ropes of scar and the puncto stitches on either side. Old bullet scars running cleanly through both ankles. An unset broken leg, and the weight on my shoulder of the man who used me as a crutch for a short walk. I don't know in my body what it's like to be hurt in these ways, but I carry a record with me anyways because it's impossible not to. So much of translation and interpretation requires me to pass someone else's language through the first person. Their I becomes my own. Their injuries and experiences enter a language that, for all I'm trying to render faithfully as theirs, is in reality only mine. This line of self and not self is like chalk on a blackboard. From far away, the line looks crisp, stark, easy to understand. But as you approach it, as your nose bumps the dusty slate, you understand that the line is not exactly unbroken, that no matter how much you erase, the particles of the chalk that were that line still float through the air. In a sense, as a translator, I do not exist on the page. When I take up the weight of someone else's story by translating it, the thing I carry is a ghost, but the teller is no lighter for my carrying the story alongside them. It's in feeling the weight of that story that I can transmit it to you also, which is why I try to erase myself in the process so that you might read someone's words that I have translated and be reminded of your mother or your aunt or your sister, your neighbors and friends, forgetting the step in the middle. I aim to become invisible because then this asylum is speaking directly to you, and you have no choice but to listen. Thank you so much.
Thank you. There are so many moments from those early pages that stuck with me the whole way through. The heat of the telephone receiver like pressed against your head, the intimacy, the physicality of the translation process, and then the metaphor of the chalk dust. Stunning. But so much of the book really is like not about the fluency of the translator, but like about lack of fluency, even in acts of translation. And throughout the book, you're learning kind of new words and new ways to relate to words. And one of them that really struck me is when you are working in this New York City clinic that you begin with, and the pages you just read, and return to somewhere in the middle. And you explain that you were supposed to refer to the people you were working with as friends. And that it always made you kind of like cringe because of like the forced intimacy and stuff like that. But at the same time, you note that it had a really important function also strategically because under kind of like legal scrutiny, you could always say, oh, no, I wasn't at, a meeting, or I wasn't being a volunteer, like helping people through the process where I was seeing friends. And I'm curious, and then you go on to use that like contaminated word that you've just critiqued like throughout the chapter. And it's really interesting, but I'm just wondering if there are any other words in any language and in any direction that were like transformed for you by the experience that you chronicle in this book, by experience working in the borderlands.
Yeah, that's such a good question. There are so many words that exist in the immigration system or in like the asylum world that sound like regular words that we say all the time, but are actually different or weighted in different ways. I feel like detention is one of them. I translated Rachel Buff's book, A is for Asylum Seeker, and in it she points out that detention is something that you get when you've been naughty at school. Like, It's this thing that's like, oh, it's no big deal. You're gonna like end up sitting at the principal's office or in the gym after school for half an hour, and like someone's gonna tell you not to pull out your cell phone. But what immigration detention is prison. It's prison.
Right.
And by using the word detention, which is also really encased in like a lot of the languages and the language around the detention system, you are sort of like erasing the fact of these folks' incarceration and the fact that they're in what is actually in 100% just prison and not a cute little after school version of like prison.
Yeah, great example. I was also really struck by, there's kind of a moment also about halfway through where it's like you're returning to the clinic after, or in the book structure, you're returning to the clinic after your time in Tijuana, and you have a transcription of, or I don't know if, I'm actually curious, like if you kind of wrote it based on a transcript, like if it was a moment that you taped or if it was recollection, but there's like you basically have what feels like a transcription of the exchange that you're having between the asylum seeker, the English-speaking volunteer, and the like real-time interpretation that you're doing. So I guess I am curious about how that was made, whether you were already recording at the time, but that's not my real question. My real question is that I noticed that you, because I am blessed to be able to read Spanish, I noticed, of course, the little differences in how you rendered the person's story. In this case, I think, it may or may not still be Myra or whatever, but the person is admitting that, they don't know for sure how somebody is a gang member, but it's obvious that they are. But she repeats at the end, I don't know, and that's something you omit in your translation, and it makes perfect sense, why you would do that. But I'm curious if there were other patterns you noticed in the way you, or if you feel like the way you rendered those stories changed as you gained more experience, or if you would speak to that.
Yeah, so those kind of dialogues recur throughout part 2, which is the part that's set in the clinic, and they are fiction.
You heard it here first. That's amazing.
Basically,
so well done.
Thank you. They're fiction that's based on people that I've met, that follows stories that meld a couple different stories together, but that are still fictional in their details. In part because working at the clinic, I didn't have I wasn't really reporting.
Yeah.
I didn't have consent to share anyone's story, and I wanted
Totally.
to make sure that was preserved. But I also wanted people, specifically people who can read in both English and Spanish, to get a feel of like the texture of these conversations. And I think the thing that you're pointing out there with the I don't know, the thing is that she says, I don't know. She lists 2 or 3 things. She was like, they had guns, they had tattoos, I don't know. And it's like, she does know.
She does know.
She does know.
It's a colloquial form of I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
it's like, I don't know, like what else do you need?
Yeah.
Like it's obvious.
Yeah, but also it wouldn't do her any good to have that I don't know or that uncertainty entered into the record.
Yes.
And so when you're doing this kind of translation interpretation that sits at the intersection between like UN ethics, like perfect interpretation of every word, and a kind of interpretation that is a little more like advocacy, then you end up making these choices, and like, I don't feel bad about them. They feel appropriate and correct, even though they're also a form of advocacy, a form of, in a sense, like removing some agency from the person who was speaking these words initially.
Assuming that agency is the main thing, like guiding our speech in general, which like it isn't. But yeah, that's fascinating. Let me see, 1 second.
No,
I have my little questions right here. I mean, this is connected to the kind of whole process of the credible fear interview and everything like that. But obviously, like kind of, and you allude to this already in the first chapter, that, you're meeting people often like in a moment of like severe trauma, like almost everybody you're meeting in a moment of severe trauma, and that like your task, especially initially, is to like elicit the details of that trauma. And that is an experience, and like the kind of demand for traumatic details like conditions the migrants' experience, the asylum seekers' experience at like every step of the way, their whole entry into the system. And I'm just curious whether you, like how you feel that, like whether you feel that extends into like the world, the literary world, and like the world of culture. I don't know. Do you think maybe it also extends? No, but I'm just curious to hear what you might think, not to say like a phrase like American dirt, but like what is the relationship? Like how did you kind of navigate that, the way the like kind of demand for traumatic detail extends its tentacles even into your own writing?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think to like put a very like explicit point on the thing that you are saying in your question is that we demand traumatic stories from people who are asking for our help. I don't think that is just contained to immigrants. It's like from anyone who needs any kind of help. We're always like, so in what way has needing help like harmed you? What like horrible things have happened to you because you don't have this assistance? Prove it, fill it out in triplicate in paperwork, and submit it to the government. And like, we'll see, we'll get back to you in 90 to 3,000 business days.
It reminds me of the like, process for reporting like a college rape or something, like the reams of paperwork.
Yeah. And that's kind of the opposite structure of that any traumatized person needs, is often able to handle, can do on their own without an advocate sitting next to them. But I do also think that very often our literature, our culture demands the same kind of thing, and also sort of demands an innocent person to visit it on. I think that there is a reason that family separation was the thing that really got headlines, that really drew people's attention to the damages of the immigration system, and that's because children in the United States are 100% of the time seen as total innocents. And families are separated all the time, like adult families, adult partners. Men are sent to men's detention centers, women are sent to women's detention centers. That's like a fact of the immigration detention system. And nobody says anything about that. But the minute that we start separating children from their families, they are innocent enough for people to be like, oh, wait, that's bad. And so I think that that is true of our culture. In American Dirt, especially, we also saw that transmitted to people who were middle class, and they needed to be a certain level of wealth in order to gain our
compassion and identification.
Yeah, in order to make it a story that like Oprah's book club was going to read and care about.
I'm curious. I actually I'm now connecting that to a part towards the end of the book where you're talking about kind of your own, like the fervency of your own wish to like account for everything that's informed your perspective, so that like you can be like the perfect speaker, so that you can like deliver these stories in the ways that's the most trustworthy, like the most likely to be believed. I know you wrote about it, but I'd love to hear you share with the audience a little bit about that. And it just occurs to me that that is another way that it feels like, after we've read the whole book, a little bit symptomatic of the same demand on the immigrant, that like the immigrant be like a perfect innocent, that like you also like have some kind of like perfectly accounted for point of view.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that I do in the book a lot is like come down on some of my fellow volunteers who are very like, I'm here, I'm helping. Yeah. Wow, I'm so good at helping. Look at me. And the frustration of that, but like also I am a person who wrote a whole entire book about helping, and like
I hear you really helped.
I did. I wrote many pages about it. And that it felt both important to point that out and to be like, I am mad and frustrated about this, but I also don't know that I'm doing any better. It felt really important to show, to be like rhetorically perfect so that no one would find anything to critique, which is like a crazy project.
Yeah, girl, good luck.
Or that if there was anything to critique,
you'd thought it first, or
like, or that it would come back on me and be like, oh, well, you are, a wealthy person who is coming into this, or you are a person who is coming into it in 2017 when this has been happening since like the beginning of time. Yeah. And I think that I both know that that is an impossible project, and I know it in the book, but it also feels, I don't know if like defensive is the right word, but it's like the more that I can show you that I am coming into this like with my whole chest and showing you all of the fucked up things I've thought or believed along the way, then you have to take me seriously, because like I wouldn't lie to you. I'm saying the things.
I'm saying the unflattering things about myself, or the things that I really appreciated that about the book. And it's a strategy I share. None of us shall be protected or saved, but I still think it's like the right strategy for ethical reasons. That just reminds me of something I was going to say earlier when you said that that part was fictional, because it's sort of connected to the question of the line between journalism and literature and all of that. But that fictionalized part, like that, well, obviously what you're saying in terms of the cataloging of the personal biases and stuff is like a thing that journalism doesn't always allow, and you say is like part of why you chose your form. And the fiction is also something not allowed in journalism. But like you all see and hear like why that was necessary. It was necessary for like specific ethical reasons, which is that like her, primary goal was not to be writing this book, but to like perform this service in this context in which recording is inappropriate, etc. So just, I think it's like one thing your book really inspired me to feel is how like all genres and approaches are needed for this kind of problem, because there are some things that certain forms can do that others can't. But anyway, I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about just some other elements of the book. There's obviously you're most kind of focused on the recent migrant crisis, on the US-Mexico borderlands and Central American migration. But obviously, there are people migrating here from all over the world, and we kind of get glimpses of those other places like throughout your text. And I'm wondering what the U.S.-Mexico borderlands kind of like taught you, or how within that context you thought about migration from other places, or whether being there really made you hyper-focused on that. It seemed like it didn't, so I'm curious.
The book focuses so much on English-Spanish translation and on folks who are coming from Spanish-speaking countries, because like that's the language I speak. That's most of who I was like forming relationships with over this time. But it was also, you know, you end up chatting with someone who is in Tijuana from Cameroon and trying to cross and claim asylum. You end up meeting somebody who came over from India who is now in the same detention center with all of these other people, and trying to communicate with them as best you can through language differences often. And the truth is that Spanish speakers are often like they're very well served in the immigration system. There is almost always a Spanish interpreter at court, so they don't have to rely on Language Line, which is a telephonic interpretation service that is garbled and weird and hard to understand, like in a courtroom. Right. And I think that being in all of these different spaces where people were coming into contact with the immigration system in one way or another, I was like working with the person sitting across from me, but also you like see all of these other people who are having all of these different experiences. You realize also that there are people who by necessity are not in the room, not in the space, not able to access whatever services you are offering. And thinking about all of the ways that up until a few months ago, I worked at an immigration nonprofit in Chicago, and it was always like, okay, what other micro community can we reach out to so that they can help us provide the services that we can provide in like these 3 languages? And how can we reach out to, you know, the community of Haitian Creole speakers in Chicago? How can we reach out to this community of any number of other languages, indigenous languages are tremendously.
A lot of the Central Americans coming, Spanish is their second language already, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's also particularly tricky because people don't realize that, specifically immigration officials. And so they will conduct interviews, they will conduct all of this official conversation in Spanish, and it's their second language, but because they're brown coming from Honduras, they're like, okay, Spanish is good, and just move things along.
Right.
But yeah, people are constantly in motion and coming in and out of the United States from all kinds of countries for all kinds of reasons. We have a specifically close relationship with the countries that are geographically closest to us, but it is something that is happening all the time and not always something that we see happening.
Yeah, definitely. There's I just want people to look out for a really beautiful moment in the book that I think you describe in such a beautiful way, like that illustrates also kind of the worlds of translation these migrants are coming from. Like you're not the only translator in the book, not just in the sense of the volunteers, but in sense of like the migrants themselves. And there's this beautiful scene with like one of the few people that you get to spend a little more time with, Sara in Tijuana. And she, when you meet her, she's already met, I guess, in Tijuana, right?
Yeah.
Her partner, and they have a young child, and her partner is like, you actually don't say where he's from. I'm like, is he Garifuna? Is he like Caribbean?
I could not figure it out. I'm pretty sure he was Haitian, but like he was extremely quiet and did not speak very much. And Sara was always like, managing him in a way, like she was like, oh, I'm gonna get this for him, or like I'm gonna, so like I didn't talk to him very much because she was just like buzzing around him all the time.
I mean, it's amazing. I mean, there's this scene where Sara, they have their child and they name their child Blessing. And Sara explains to you that the reason the child is named Blessing is because Sara was listening to him bless the child in his own language. She did not understand that language, but she kept hearing a repeated word and asked him what that word was. And he translated it, I guess, into English. Probably their shared language was English, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. And like that's how the daughter got the name. Just like I love the way you pick up details like that and the kind of language practices of other people. Feels like that's so real. You know, people are meeting in these places, life is continuing in these places, and people are like using the language that they have at hand. Okay, so again, switching gears a little bit, I wanted to ask, I'm just like, it's a really beautifully constructed book. And I'm curious, and it's constructed in a unique way. You kind of like structure it almost by metaphor in 3 parts. It's 3 parts, right? 4
Yeah.
parts? Okay, cool. And then each of them are kind of like these slim little chapters. And I'm curious how you came to that structure, because also like this, you're writing about an experience that you didn't begin as a book, which I like also know how that is.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, the immigration system is like characterized by all these super strict forms. Like the interview is so strict, like all of it. But with this book, it was very open-ended how it could have been structured. So I'm curious how you found your way through that. And
Yeah, that was one of my big, I know that you
Terrible.
are in the middle of like
Terrible.
drafting or just finished drafting your
Yeah.
own thing, and structure is bad. But initially, everything was mixed up together into one big like soup, and I was trying to keep all of these different threads of like Tijuana and the prose clinic and the courtroom taut and like moving around each other, and so that you would remember what was happening in each of the different ones, but jumping around into each of these different spaces kind of simultaneously. And after I hit about 50 pages of drafting, I was like, this is not working. And it took a little bit of playing around with the metaphors that were already in the book, and trying to come up with new ones as well, that I realized that it made sense to orient things both a little bit geographically and a little bit around these metaphors that needed a little bit more room to breathe, and that could be extended across each of the 3 sections. So the first one is rivers, which is where the book gets its name. We talk about like the geographical river border of the Rio Grande / Rio Bravo. The second one is a table around the idea of sobremesa, which is like the space that you create with other people around a dinner table after you're done eating, and just kind of kicking around, drinking an extra beer, doodling whatever's going on in that space.
very ingenious the way you lodged a history of the United Fruit Company at the sobremesa.
Thank you. We are all eating bananas after dinner, but
I'm like, anyway, go ahead. Yeah.
and it's about food, and also the table that we're all sitting around at the clinic, and a metaphor that I borrowed from Kate Briggs's incredible book, This Little Art, of translation being a table that you have to build for yourself, and also all the people sitting around the table, and also the food on the table, and you can kind of see how that builds up. And then the last section is about walls, and that is both courtroom walls, detention center walls, all of the, like the border wall, all of these different things that sort of incarcerate and hem people in sort of the carceral aspect of the immigration system.
Thank you. Okay, so I have one more question before we like turn it over, because I'm sure people are eager to join the conversation. You don't talk about it much in the book, but it shows up on your beautiful cover, and I feel like also this was one of the kind of elements that connected us early on. But I know you're also an embroiderer, and I think about translation and embroidery both as a kind of like women's work, and also as a kind of work where the artistry isn't always recognized. But I'm curious how, like, if you see any connections and the quality of attention or between those practices for you and how they're in conversation in your body.
Yeah, I absolutely do. Like the section I just read, translation, I think, is something that happens in your body, and it's something that you kind of figure out how to do, especially if you are raised bilingual. It's something that you like realize how to do almost at the same time as you're acquiring both your languages as like a very small child. And I was taught to knit and embroider by my mom, who's here, and from when I was really, really little. And it also feels like this same sort of like, oh, I know what to do next. My husband watches me knit and he's like, it's like alchemy. Like, I don't know what you're doing, but there's a sweater there suddenly.
Like how you're able to follow the thread of your mother's conversation. I love that. I love that chapter, the original language.
Yeah. And it's also the same. I feel like translation and embroidery are both iterative and both very focused and also a little loosely focused in a way that if you are like zeroing in too much, you sort of gray out everything else, but you need to be sort of in this state of, what's the word?
I don't know, suspended
negative capability.
Negative capability, suspended animation.
And so I think those two are joined. And about the cover, the artist is here, Paula de la Calle. She's amazing. And
Raise
she's
your hand,
also
please. Raise a
textile and embroidery artist, among like many, many other kinds of art. And I love the work she did. She's so amazing.
She bodied it.
She did.
So on that note, thank you so much. I just realized that 30 minutes have passed. So I shall open it to the rest of you. Please, any questions or comments for Alejandra?
Really quick, just raise your hand so that we can bring you the mic so the folks online can hear your question as well.
Thank you very much. I'll just go first before I lose kind of my faith. Thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. I was just wondering about your the second metaphor you introduced as a structure for your book, The Table. And I found it quite interesting that you kind of put it into, like, as I understood it, in a positive kind of context, as a, like, in the clinic, the table where you sit around. And I just know it from like also legal clinic in the German context, how the table is also like this kind of negatively connotated kind of material that often stands in between when you're like talking to, like, giving advice, and it can have like this loadedness of interrogation. And so whether you might have a comment on that, how the table kind of also has perhaps this other meaning in this context.
Yeah, no, that's a great, I don't talk about the table as like you're talking about it, which is to say like a barrier or a thing that separates sort of like the advice giver from the advice receiver or the interrogator from the interrogated. But I do talk about the ways that the conversations that I'm having with people do slide between, like, here's a conversation I'm having with you that in which you are free to tell me as much or as little as you want about your own experiences, and the conversation that I need to have with them, which is to say, I need you to tell me as much as you can possibly remember in order to fill this form out, in order to give you the best chance of staying here. And that is not going to be a pleasant experience for you, but I need you to keep working on it, or like we need to stay in this moment of discomfort or like moment of interrogation in order to fill out the application as best as we can. And so I really love that you brought the table into that, which is not something that I had done in the book, but it makes a lot of sense as both a center of congregation and also a barrier.
Thank you. Super excited about the book. It sounds amazing.
Thank you.
So I'm really curious because you were talking about how you're meeting people at moments of intense trauma. And so can you share some methods that you use to help folks feel safe? Because it seems like you probably did an amazing job helping so many different people feel safe.
An amazing question from my beautiful friend who is a social worker.
She might have some ideas.
Yeah.
I'll take notes.
Yeah, I got some training from this, or in this, like before, or not before, kind of after starting doing this work, because that is how things are at really rushed clinics sometimes. But I think the things that most stuck with me and the things that I still use every day is an idea of like informed consent, sitting down before this conversation and being like, here's what's going to happen. Here are the kinds of questions I'm going to be asking you. Here is what the form needs. Here is, you can tell me and not tell me like whatever you want. Here are the consequences of telling me or not telling me anything. Here are the ways that that can hurt or help your case, depending. Here is the things that you can do if you need to take a break. If you want to stop being in this situation immediately, you can come back next week. You can text me. If you want to go home and write all of this out instead, you can do that. And so just really explaining and giving somebody as much agency as I possibly could in a moment that otherwise would feel very restrictive and not giving people choices. And I think that, and not doing my absolute best not to judge someone. People are coming to you in really difficult situations that you cannot imagine being in yourself often. And people make a lot of different kinds of choices in these situations, and they often feel very specific ways about those choices. And your job is not to be like, you did what? It's to be like, that sounds really hard. I can tell that you are like struggling with this a great deal. I'm so sorry you had to make that choice. Or I'm so sorry that that's what's happening. And so I think that these are the things that I used as part of these conversations that made me at least feel like I was doing the most I could to keep someone safe and comfortable in a situation that was often re-traumatizing.
Mm.
Hi, this is great. So I have one question coming from the worries of an ex-journalist, and my question is to you about writing about the pain and those in the pain, and thinking, like having the worries that how it will be read by them. When I was practicing journalism back in Iran, I had these questions always coming from so many folks in a dead-end situations, but I was just going and doing reports and writing, and at the very beginning I was telling that maybe this report or this narrative will do something. Then I learned my lesson that I'm not going to promise anything. At that moment I was just telling that it's important to be recorded, and at the end I was receiving everything and not saying something. And I had sometimes this I don't know how to call it, but this trouble of like always thinking that how it will be read, not by public, but by those that I'm sometimes even gaining a name by writing about their pain. So I just wonder that if any of the folks that you wrote about had the chance to read your work, and how did you deal with that in the process of your writing?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's such a good question. There is, because of the nature of my work, I often wasn't able to form really deep relationships with people. But the one person whose story I think I go into the most throughout the book, which is Sarah, who you were talking about, is a woman that I'm still in touch with. We're still friends on Facebook. And as I was getting towards the end of the book and kind of realizing that what I had written about her was not going to change very much, I translated all of that and sent it to her and said, I had asked her kind of generally before, like, is it okay if I write about the relationship that we had while we were at the border and those like days that we spent together? And she was like, yes, of course, don't worry. And I was like, okay, that's very different than actually seeing that. I've had the experience of people writing about me, and it's like, even when it's a friend or someone that you know, it's always like kind of horrifying. And so I went and I translated everything back and I sent it to her, and I was like, tell me what you think. Like, I can put anything in that you feel is important for me to share about your story. I told her the things that I had taken out about her story and why, because I also knew that she had some like questions about anonymity and certain people being able to sort of identify her from what I had written. And so I was like, these are the things I took out. Let me know if you want me to take out anything else. And she was really excited to read it. I think she sent it to her immigration attorney, who also approved it, which also made me feel a lot better about everything that I included. And she is, I think, the only person who is super recognizable or super like an individual person, and a lot of the other ones are sort of mentions of people that I met or conversations that are recounted, but that don't go very deeply into people's stories very much. And so I do wonder sometimes if like there will come a point where one of these people will read and recognize themselves and have feelings about it. But it's also relatively brief mentions, I would say. And so I have a fair amount of discomfort around, like you said, like making my name from these narratives and these stories that were shared with me, sometimes in the spirit of like journalism or in the spirit of wanting to share their stories, and other times not out of their stories, but out of the feelings that I got from the conversations with them, or sort of the emotional response of talking to them and listening to their stories. But that was a great question. Thank you.
I'm curious sort of how you like took care of yourself and your ability to remain like helpful and present, like hearing just like all of these traumatic stories, and also being in a situation like politically that was just like getting worse every minute. And I just wondered like, yeah, how, one, just like taking care of yourself, but also just like giving your all to the process and being present. And if that was difficult, I imagine it was difficult, but sort of how you maintain that.
Yeah, so this is something that I struggled with a lot during the writing and also during the like work itself. And so I think initially it was a little bit easier because the work that I was doing was sort of concentrated. The clinic I was doing was one night a week, and every other night a week I did not have to think about it. I could be apart from it, and that meant that when I went back to the clinic, I could go back with my full self and with my full attention. And the same was true of Tijuana. Like, I was there for a short, concentrated amount of time, and I knew that afterwards I would go back and I would still have like another week of winter break to do nothing and like empty my brain. Working on the book, which is theoretically something that they tell you that you should do every day, but like, I also, initially I would be like, no, I have to work on it. Like, it doesn't matter what's going on in the world. And eventually I realized that like, if I was pushing myself too hard to write when my mind was on other things, or when I was sort of, for a number of years, I worked at an immigration nonprofit during the drafting of this book. And so it was very present in my life, like all of the news, all of the things that were happening, all of the headlines every day. And sometimes, you know, it's like things that you can handle, or like it doesn't feel overwhelming. It doesn't feel scary in the same way when you're sitting like in an office in Chicago, like drafting emails, like it's fine. And other times it feels real and vivid and present. And those were the times where I was like, I don't need to be working on the book right now. I need to be either focused on the community that I'm working with. I need to be focused on other things, and it's okay if the book is not the thing that's happening. And so I think through giving myself that, I wouldn't even call it like periods of rest, just periods of like, the book is not the important thing right now, that was fine. I also rested a lot. Rest is good and important.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, you kind of talked about with writing how you may follow like a certain thread as you figure out the structure of what you're talking about. I was wondering if there's anything you would be willing to share that maybe you had been really excited to share, but realized it didn't really fit within the narrative of this book. Not to spoil your next book or anything, but.
Ooh, that's a good question. I think that there's probably more stories or more individual scenes. I also had dreams of doing a research trip into the desert in the Southwest that did not materialize, unfortunately, due to time constraints. But there are like always 1,000 more sites where immigration is happening and where people are having these experiences that I think could have fit into the book or could have been part of it that didn't end up in this particular version. But they're also often places that have also been written about a great deal. They're, fantastic books about what it's like to cross the Sonoran Desert on foot. There are really good books about sort of being undocumented long-term in cities.
I actually wanted to jump in there. I was curious, what books you were drawing on or what voices you see yourself in community with, writing in this territory, because obviously there's been kind of a renaissance of writing along the border, and I'm curious what books you turned to as you were drafting this and inspired you.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about the Valeria Luiselli Tell Me How It Ends, which was a book that I read right before starting to do this work, and I feel like she comes into it from a very similar perspective as I did, which is to say, as a privileged person who sort of knew what was going on, but hadn't really thought about how it affected her life or any of these things, and then suddenly was it sort of crash landed in her life when her own immigration attorney, I think, was oh, I'm going to go represent unaccompanied minors because they really need my help and I can't work on your case anymore. And that sort of snapped her into action. And her book had a really similar effect on me of suddenly being oh, there's this thing that's happening. I have a skill that I'm able to do that is helpful to folks who are in this situation. Let me figure out how to get involved. I also think Javier Zamora Solito is...
I went to high school with Javier.
Did you really?
Yeah. It's an amazing book. I was hoping you would mention it. Yeah.
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, Javier was himself an unaccompanied minor, and the book is about his journey coming up on his own with a group of people that did not include his parents to reunite with his parents in the United States. And it's this beautiful memoir.
From El Salvador when he was 9.
Yeah.
Cool.
I'm having that experience where I suddenly forget anything else I've ever
read.
I know.
Woe unto the author who was asked about books.
I have read many things.
I know you've read a lot. She has read so many books. Trust me. I mean, she mentions a lot of them in the book.
I tried. Oh, the other essay I want to mention actually is Lena Monzer's Translation in War. And it is about her experiences translating for women who are going through the Syrian war, and also about her experiences coming to the United States from Syria as a child. And the language in that is incredibly beautiful. It is in Asterisks Journal's kitchen table translations, which also
that's an excellent volume.
Yeah, has
edited
a lot
by
to
Madhu
do
Kaza. Yeah. Anyway.
With what's in the book, but you can also find it on LitHub if you are not looking to buy a little journal of things.
Which you should. Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question if anybody has one. Otherwise,
cool. I also have a question from online. Did you raise your hand?
I did, yeah. But can we do both?
We can do both.
Okay.
We can do both, yeah. We can do both. We can do both.
Okay. I'm not entirely sure this question is going to make sense, but so much of immigration in the U.S. feels like where ignorance meets absurdity. like so many people they haven't had interactions, including me, with the system. And so then learning about it and trying to explain it is like, there's so much that is simply absurd about it. And so I'm curious, like, how much, and with a book like this, so much of it could be writing towards yourself and writing towards an audience. And I wondered, through the experience of writing the book, how much of it was writing to integrate and understand your experience, and how much of it was to explain to others what those systems look like.
It definitely initially started as a way to sort of integrate my own experiences, to explain to myself what it was that I had witnessed. And then the thing that I am incredibly grateful to both my agent, Dana Murphy, and my editor, Danny Vasquez, for is that they asked me questions. They were like, okay, hold up. Like, what is a credible fear interview? What is La Lista? Like, what is this paperwork that you're talking about? And it was through their relatively, like, had not been working at an immigration legal nonprofit for the last 3 years eyes that I was like, okay, these are the things that I need to explain to get the point across. And working with both of them was kind of helped clarify the spaces where it needed to be a little bit more outward facing in order for the introspective conversations to like make a little more sense.
Cool. And our question from the chat also, I think, kind of leads us to looking forward. Hello to the chat. And so they asked, did the experiences you write about or your writing process inform the immigration work you do now?
Yeah, it absolutely does. So like I said, I got into doing immigration work because of a book. And I think it's one of those worlds where you like dip a toe in and then you're suddenly like, oh, I could be and I maybe should be doing this full time all the time. And so, like I said, I started off volunteering once a week. Then it was a project that took me to the border for a bunch of days in a row and really like immersed me in this world. And then suddenly it was my full-time job. And now it's working with a number of different orgs to do fundraising, to do things like that. I work most closely right now with the Midwest Immigration Bond Fund, which does exactly what it says. They raise money to get people out of immigration detention in the Midwest or who have connections to the Midwest. And they're fantastic. And so both writing the book and the experiences I had while writing the book that I write the book about sort of like reinforced my commitment to keep doing this work.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the People's Forum. Thanks to all of you. Thank you, Alejandra.
Thank you so much,
This
Carina.
book was beautiful.
Yeah.
It's a blessing.
Thank you.
Thank you.